He is a professor of apologetics, ethics, and philosophy of religion at Trinity Western University. He's also the director of the Institute of Christian Apologetics. I assume that's also Trinity Western organization,
yeah.
Is it, Paul? And you've written this remarkable book, Why People Don't Believe, Confronting 7 Challenges to Christian Faith. First of all, I was very intrigued with how you wrote it, your style. It's a real good read, and I want to thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
But I thought that, in the light of 9/11, chapter 3 is religion and violence.
Yeah.
That we could spend this entire interview just talking about that aspect of the book. We look at 9/11, or we look at lesser events like a suicide bombing in a pizzeria on Yehuda Street in Jerusalem, or we look at a bombing in Afghanistan. Apparently, as we speak right now, the Jewish or the American embassy is under siege right now in Afghanistan. A couple of days ago, the Israeli embassy in Egypt was under siege by thousands of people. We look at this and we assume that because these people are Muslim, that all men and women of Islamic faith are extremists. You make the point that there's often a confusion between extremists and the mainstream.
Yeah, that's a huge point. It's a very important point to always make sure we have clear, because you see, as anybody who's been out in the public marketplace and representing your point of view knows, every group has its own mainstream, and every group has its own people who are on the edges, on the fringes. Sometimes they're called the lunatic fringes. Sometimes they're called the embarrassing supporter. The person who will speak on your behalf, but really won't represent what you say. And sometimes you even need to say, I really can't agree with what that person said, even though they claim to be representing you. And it points up the danger, really, of us looking at some other group and picking out 2 or 3 spokespeople who we think represent that group, and then using their comments to represent the mainstream of the group. They may or they may not. And when you say some of the new atheists who I've written about here in the book, when they often look toward religion and particularly Christianity, they'll pick up people who you and I would say, well, that person doesn't represent me, that person doesn't represent me, and they'll use them to speak on behalf of Christianity. And the huge problem with this is that if you do that, you run the risk of misrepresenting the entire group that you are supposedly talking about.
Well, a good example of this, a few months ago, this pastor whose name escapes me in the southern states who publicly burned the Quran.
Well, that's a very good example.
Yeah, and as far as the people, on the other side of the ocean were concerned, this was Christianity.
Well, that's right. And the media doesn't help either, because they'll give that person a lot of airtime, and sometimes he'll speak as though he's a Christian without making distinctions. And so we need to remember the same thing plays the other way. Sometimes we'll see someone speak in the name of Islam, and we'll say, yeah, well, look what those Muslims have done. And we need to remember that may be a very small percentage of Muslims who would even agree with that person. Because just as within Christianity we have different interpretations and different groups, they have the same thing within Islam as well. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't extremists in all these different camps. There really are. And they are of great concern. But it's a big mistake to paint the entire group with the same brush. And the simple proof of that is that we never like it when people do that to us. And so, just to be fair, we ought not to be doing that to others.
Now, when you talk about the new atheists, you're talking about Harris, Dawkins, and Hitchens, right? Those 3 guys.
Well, and there's a few others who go by those, but those are 3 major ones that I talk about in the book.
Yeah, they're high profile because of their writings and their television appearances and so on. And in many ways, as you say in the book, they create a straw man, they knock him down.
Yeah, well, precisely, because they become, sometimes it's almost become experts at looking at certain people who would you and I would say misrepresent the faith entirely, but they use those as the spokespeople for Christianity and other religious groups as well. And then it becomes a distortion, which then they knock down. But in the process, they do a great disservice, because the rest of the world out there doesn't really have access to the kind of information you and I have, and they begin to think that religion, Christianity across the board, it really is a force for evil in the world.
Now, you refer to the fact that they'll often take some of the passages of the Old Testament that are quite violent.
Yeah.
Especially when it came to wiping out an entire city, for instance, men, women, and children.
Yeah.
And say, no, if this is biblical morality, then we want nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
How do you respond to that?
Well, I mean, there's a number of things you need to say, but the first thing you always have to keep in mind is that, well, number one, these are puzzling passages, and they're puzzling for us precisely because they seem to be out of sync with what we see the main themes of the Bible to be, of God being such a gracious, compassionate God who is really concerned for the unempowered, the widows and the orphans and people in distress. You see that from the beginning of the Bible right through to the end. And that's the first thing I need to tell people. I always tell people, because this comes up often, is that we need to read all these passages in their context, literary context, social context, historical context, especially ones that are a long ways away from us, like those ones there. And you realize that even in the first 5 books of the Bible, which is where almost all those difficult passages come from, even there, God gave commands against slavery, against child abuse, calling for hospitality to strangers, and very powerful, positive commands. And if you read further on in the Old Testament, you see his real requirements: to do justice, to love mercy, to walk humbly. And then you come to the words of Jesus, the greatest moral teacher of all. You've seen me, you've seen the Father. You know, and all recognize that. With the real difficult ones, we sometimes have to say, you know, there's things going on there that we may not understand totally. God had purposes in mind. At the beginning of time, the nation of Israel was just fighting for their own existence in very warring cultures. They were coming to know their God bit by bit in what we call progressive revelation. And God had purposes to keep them as a useful vehicle through which he could communicate his love and his heart to others. And I guess the question you have to ask is, could there have been situations where God knew that the only way to do that was to, because Israel continually fell into the ways of their neighboring groups around them, even sacrificing their own children because they wanted to be like the neighbors around them. Could it be that God knew that in certain cases some of these actions, which seem very harsh and puzzling to us, were necessary in order to maintain Israel as a useful vehicle through which he could communicate his love and his grace to others? But I would just say it's easy to make these snappy judgments without reading these passages in context, in their context in the Bible.
I mean, God is called often in the Old Testament the Lord of Heaven's armies.
Yeah.
I mean, he's often represented as a warrior. You know?
Yeah.
And that's a part of the overall. But it's I mean, we gotta just simply acknowledge the fact we can't turn our heads away from the fact that there are some, as you say, some very troubling passages there. Now, what you talk about reasons to believe that violence would not end if religion were eradicated. And when I came to that point in the chapter, I thought of a book I've read by Peter Hitchens, who is brother to Christopher Hitchens. And he talks about his brother's worldview, essentially philosophical bent, you know, atheistic and angry at God. And he said, you know, Christopher's already got his ideal, you know, in the history of the Soviet Union. You know, there was a whole nation that for at least 70 years eradicated faith. Or look at Stalin's reign or Mao Zedong's reign. I mean, between the two of them, Stalin and Mao Zedong killed about 100 million of their own people. In the name of irreligion, trying to wipe out faith. And you make the point that just because some of the people who perpetrate violence are religious doesn't mean that religion should be tarred with that stick.
Well, I mean, this in my mind is a critical point, because if you start tarring religion with that and saying this is really the problem, then it should follow that if we remove religion from the world, the violence would end. And so that became in my mind one of the 2 key questions I really wanted to focus on in the book, and that was, if you did ever succeed in eradicating religion from the world, which of course is a lost cause, that'll never happen, but if it ever could happen, would the violence, even what we call today religious violence, would that actually cease? Are there any reasons to think that? And when you look around at Russia, at China, at North Korea, at Vietnam, even look at places like the French Revolution, different, but still 4 million people died in the name of liberty and equality. Rwanda, where you had tribal violence. Look all around the world, and it becomes very, very clear that some of the worst violence in the world is committed in the name of irreligion.
You know, when you mentioned the French Revolution and liberty and equality, which, you know, are high ideals, and all of the injustices and the horrors that were done in the name of liberty and equality, I thought of the modern day when so much is going on in the name of democracy. You know, I wonder if
that's interesting.
You know, I wonder if you know, from an historical perspective, one day we may say, you know what, we tried to impose democracy on peoples who did not understand democracy and never could have been led in a democratic way, who understand only the strong man.
That's very interesting, and that's a very complicated issue to raise, because it seems to us that democracy is carte blanche, better, and everybody should have it, whether they want it or not. We should be, and that's why sometimes we see it not working. We try to impose it, and as soon as we walk away, it collapses again. And tolerance is another one of those. It just means that all these things, as good as they are, like liberty and equality, what can you say bad about those? I mean, some people have, but not many. Democracy, nationalism, can these things all be abused? Yeah, they can. And religion itself can be abused as well. And even the words of Jesus can be taken and twisted around and be abused. And so I finally learned, as I was writing this book, in a new way, that you cannot judge something by its abuse or by its neglect. And I think that's a huge problem being carried out by the new atheists at this point. Looking at religion, Christianity, others, religion per se, they're saying it's abuse, and they judge it by its abuse.
You know, that's a good point. Again, as I was reading, I thought of an example. You could stand back and look at the Canadian family right now, where almost half of them are breaking up in divorce. You could look at the abuse of children and all of the dysfunctions, and build a real case against families.
Yeah, I suppose
just on the basis of the of the basis of the dysfunctions. But we neglect the fact that, you know, for every dysfunctional family, there are some very functional families creating wonderful children.
And you should not judge a family by its dysfunction.
Yeah, or judge a family by its dysfunction. You know, the scripture says love covers a multitude of sins. We just have a few minutes left. You talk about the religious, the political, and the cultural elements that contribute to violence. And I was interested when you quoted Osama bin Laden, and also, his name escapes me, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood.
Hassan al-Banna.
Oh, right, okay, back in 1928, was it?
1928,
1928. Both of them were cultural and spiritual idealists.
Yeah. It's a very powerful point, which this is a material that I began to research as I wrote. These people go way back to those dates, and you can go back further than that. And you find people, especially in the Muslim world, who looked at the Western influence from the West coming to them, and they saw this was a very destructive influence on our culture, on our way of life, on our beliefs, seducing our young people away from the faith. And so a large part of the reaction has been not so much to Christianity, although in their minds often Christianity and the Western culture are bound up together, but it's a desire in their way of thinking to protect and defend their cultural way of life. And you can't really, as Bernard Lewis has said, is an eminent historian of Islam, you can't really understand the Muslim reaction to the West without seeing that particular fact.
And also you refer to bin Laden's comments about the disgrace or the shame imposed on the Arab peoples over about 80 years from the time when the Ottoman Empire was ended, and the Caliphate was destroyed, and various Arab countries were created by the Brits just with a stroke of a pen. And then the greatest indignity, the American army having bases in Saudi Arabia. This was a great shame to him.
Well, and there again, I don't think you can understand any of these acts of violence and this reaction without understanding that. And that's why Robert Pape, this man who studied these things from the University of Chicago, political scientist, has argued that really the deepest causes of the violence are not religious whatsoever. He said religion is neither necessary nor sufficient to bring about these acts of violence. Normally the causes are deeper, and they're politically motivated, often to remove some foreign aggressor who you don't have the power to remove through normal military means, and so they'll resort to different kinds of violent acts to do that. And religion can be pressed into service to be used for that.
Your book ends with a great chapter on just some of the contributions of Christian faith to the world, including hospitals, universities, the Red Cross, Salvation Army, the YMCA. I mean, it goes on and on and on. And I wish we had time to cover that. But the book is called Why People Don't Believe, Confronting 7 Challenges to Christian Faith. It's published by Baker, I believe, right?
Yes, it is, yeah.
And this is a book that if you have interest in something like this, it really is good stuff, coming from a man who knows what he's talking about, Paul Chamberlain, Dr. Paul Chamberlain. Thanks for coming our way.
Thank you very much.